Hello, my name is Patrick Moore, and I'm going to talk to you about my new book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. I know that sounds a little bit sensational, but I think you'll agree with me that it's a good title for this book. First, though, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my history. I grew up on a tiny floating village, a logging camp, on the northwest tip of Vancouver Island in the rainforest right by the Pacific. This was Winter Harbor. After I went to high school, I enrolled in the University of British Columbia in the sciences: biology, biochemistry, genetics, a bit of forestry because that's the industry I grew up in, and life science became my passion. It was in the late 1960s. It was the height of the Cold War, the height of the Vietnam War, the threat of all-out nuclear war, and the emerging consciousness of the environment. I learned about the word ecology from a professor of ecology at the university, a word that had not yet been printed in the popular press. Ecology is about how all living things are interrelated, not only with each other, but with the earth, with the water and the land and the air. This is me on my way to Amchitka Island in the Aleutians on a protest voyage, the first voyage of Greenpeace against United States hydrogen bomb testing. We had been meeting in a church basement in Vancouver for over a year, planning this voyage. The United States was detonating 5 megaton hydrogen bombs underground out in the Aleutian Islands, where, except for Alaska, they were actually closer to Canada, Russia, and Japan than they were to the United States. That was one thing we didn't think was fair, but we also thought it was time to bring people's attention to the continued threat of all-out nuclear war between the United States and what was then called the Soviet Union, Russia. This is the crew of the Greenpeace boat on its way to Alaska. I'm under the P. We all looked like a bunch of hippies, but actually we were mostly pretty much professionals. I was doing a PhD in ecology, and many of the others were journalists and doctors and lawyers, geographers, and people who were interested in the world and studying hard and wanting to do something to make it a better place. President Nixon canceled those hydrogen bomb tests in 1972. Thus we won. And much to our surprise, we had actually created a spearhead for the campaign against nuclear testing by going out in the boat and aiming it towards the nuclear tests. This got us on TV around the world, and before long people were marching in the streets by the tens of thousands, calling for an end to the nuclear testing. Well, we'd done that job, and we decided to turn our attention to another really important subject, and that is, at that time, in the early to mid-1970s, Russia and Japan in particular were killing 30,000 great whales a year still. Very few people even knew about that because it was going on over the horizon, out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the Antarctic, and a bit in the Atlantic. So a whale scientist named Paul Spong came to us and said, "You guys are the only ones who know how to go in boats, and someone has to go out there and stop these people from killing the whales." And so we decided that's what we would do. And here I am in this photo driving a rubber Zodiac boat, an inflatable boat, with my late friend Fred Easton, the cameraman. This is the first encounter with the Russian factory whaling fleet in 1975. We approached the whalers. This is on the right is the harpoon boat or the killer boat. There'd be about a dozen of them. And then on the left is the factory ship where they take the whales up and cut them up on deck. It's a floating whale factory. That's not all we did, though, just to document this. There I am in front of the harpoon with my cameraman in the bow, and basically getting in front of the harpoon to protect the fleeing whales. These are 3 sperm whales that are fleeing from the harpoon boat, And, well, I guess we didn't save a lot of whales physically, but we had a shot of film which showed the harpoon being fired over one of my crewmates' heads into a whale. It was about 10 seconds, and it made Greenpeace famous all around the world. Our next campaign was aimed at ending the slaughter of 250,000 nursing harp seal pups every year off the east coast of Canada. We felt that it was really inhumane to kill a marine mammal pup when it's still nursing with its mother. You wouldn't do that for deer or moose or bears or any other species. But because they were a marine mammal, I guess people thought it was still okay to do that. We stopped this seal hunt so that today no nursing seal pups can be taken for any reason. But why did I leave Greenpeace then after 15 years? Because I did in 1986. In the early years, Greenpeace had a very strong humanitarian orientation. To save people from nuclear war, for example, you have to care about human beings to want to accomplish that. But as time went on, the peace which represented civilization and peaceful society sort of dropped off, and all that was left was the green. And now many of people in the environmental movement, including people in Greenpeace, were saying that humans were the enemies of the earth, the enemies of nature, as if we were the only bad species in the world. And for me, that just didn't work. I think it's too much like original sin to say that humans are the only bad species on the planet. Like, I think we're born with both good and bad potential in us, like probably all animals are. And we just have to learn to get along with people. We are a social species, but we're not an evil species by nature. So I didn't like that at a philosophical level. But the sharp end of the stick was when my fellow directors, none of whom had any formal science education, decided we should start a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. Now, chlorine as an element is very dangerous and toxic. It was used as a chemical weapon in World War I, so it can kill people. But table salt is sodium chloride. It's an essential nutrient. So I told my fellow directors, you've got to have a little bit more nuanced position on this subject, because chlorine is actually one of the building blocks of the universe, one of the 94 natural elements found on Earth. And not only that, adding it to drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health, preventing waterborne communicable diseases like cholera. And also, about 85% of our medicines, our pharmaceuticals, are made with chlorine chemistry, and 25% of them actually have chlorine in them. Unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears because there was, I guess, a real compelling feeling that we could raise money against the evil chlorine. They called it the devil's element. So you can see why I had to leave. I couldn't be in an organization that had abandoned science to that degree. I decided to become a sensible environmentalist, basing my policies on science and logic, not on sensationalism, misinformation, and fear, which much of the environmental movement adopted at that time and still practice it all the time today. Okay, the subject of my book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. There's a sort of holy grail in physics called the unified field theory, where it's thought maybe someday all aspects of physics, magnetism, gravity, the whole electromagnetic spectrum, will all be put into one formula, sort of like E equals mc squared on steroids. That may never happen, but I've got a unified theory, and it's about scare stories. It seems to me very clear that virtually every scare story there is today, and there are many of them, are based on things that either are invisible, like carbon dioxide and radiation, or so remote, like polar bears and coral reefs, that no one can observe and verify it for themselves, at least almost no one. So it's easy to make a story up about something that is invisible or so remote that you can't go and see it for yourself, because how can you check as to whether it's true or not? Take GMOs, for example, genetically modified foods. They say there's something dangerous about them. It must be in them because they're saying you shouldn't eat them. What is the dangerous thing in GMOs? Well, first, it must be invisible, because no one has shown us what it is, and GMOs have been around for 25 years. Oh, then what's its name? If it is invisible, it surely should have a name and a chemical formula like everything else in the world does. There's no thing that doesn't have a name. Well, the thing in GMOs doesn't have a name, so that's about all you need to know that it's a hoax. There is nothing in GMOs that is harmful, and if there was, they would know what it is. Let's get on with a little bit about climate change. I can't give you even 5% of my knowledge about climate change in an hour or hour and a half discussion. It takes longer than the whole hour and a half to do that. But here we start with the history, the last 570 million years of history, of temperature and carbon dioxide. So this is the center of the debate on climate. They say that it's carbon dioxide that controls the world's temperature. But if you look at the big circle there, you can see nearly 200 million years where carbon dioxide, which is the purple line, and temperature, which is the blue line, are completely out of sync with each other. When one goes up, the other goes down. When one goes down, the other goes up. This is not good evidence for a causal relationship between two different factors. Of course, there are times when they are in sync with each other, but they're out of sync with each other at least as often as they're in sync. Many factors that are even correlated strongly are not a cause-effect relationship. Quite often a third factor is making the two of them look like they're in sync with each other, or that one causes the other, but it's not the case. This graph is all you need to know that CO2 is not the main controlling factor of global temperature. But most people in this debate don't even want to talk about anything before 1850. And if you'll see on the graph there, I have a pointer to 1850, which shows where we, humans, started putting some CO2 back in the atmosphere where it had come from in the first place. As you can see on the purple line, there's been a general lowering of CO2 all through the last 500 million years. It's gone up and down at times, but the net effect is a strong downward trend from about 6,000 parts per million to only a couple of hundred parts per million before we came along. You can also see some ice ages there, in particular the Silurian Ice Age on the very far left, which shows that the Ice Age occurred while CO2 was up over 5,000 parts per million, which is more than 10 times what it is today. There is simply no good evidence to indicate, or certainly not to prove, that CO2 has very much to do with global temperature. Here's the last 150 million years. There's the graph for CO2. You saw it in the previous slide, going down continuously for the last 150 million years. It shows there that the present level is 420 parts per million. Indeed, during the most recent major glaciation, which was only 20,000 years ago, which is a blink in nature's eye, CO2 went down to 180 parts per million. The death of plants occurs at 150 parts per million. Plants don't just need CO2, they need a certain amount of it in the atmosphere. It's actually quite amazing that vegetation, plants, can survive with a 180 parts per million CO2. That's 0.018% of the atmosphere. It's almost insignificant, and yet plants are able to still survive at that low level. Why has CO2 been dropping continuously through the long millions of years of ages? A simple answer that very few people know about. About 500 million years ago, marine species, which had evolved during the Cambrian explosion of life when multicellular life first began. It's also important to know that for the first 3 billion years of life, it was microscopic, unicellular, and confined to the water, mostly to the oceans. There was no life on the land for the first 3 billion years of life's existence on the Earth. But after the Cambrian explosion and the existence of multi-celled species, like hundreds and thousands of species evolved at that time, they also soon learned, many of them, to make armor plating for themselves, shells, out of calcium in the sea and carbon dioxide in the sea. There's 50 times as much carbon dioxide in the oceans as there is in the atmosphere. So that is a very rich supply. But as these creatures drew CO2 out of the water to make these shells for themselves, like a knight in armor, in fact, they also pulled CO2 out of the atmosphere to make up for the CO2 that was lost in the oceans, to sediments. All the limestone, chalk, and marble in the earth today, the White Cliffs of Dover, for example, all the marble you see in all the cathedrals around the world, was made by these marine calcifying species. All of that marble and limestone and chalk is of life origin. It didn't come from a volcano. It came from life, and it came from life that was sucking CO2 out of the ocean and putting it on the bottom as sediment, thus taking it away from the circle of life between the atmosphere, the oceans, and the living world, reducing the level of carbon dioxide available to life. Here's the last 65 million years of global temperature. We know this to be the case. This is a fact from marine sediment cores. Drilling down into marine sediments, there are isotopes that can be looked at and can see what the temperature was at that time. The Eocene thermal maximum 50 million years ago was one of the warmest times in the last 500 million years. There might have been one other time that was as warm or warmer. Then, a 50 million year cooling period with a bit of a pause between 35 and 15 million years ago descended into the Pleistocene Ice Age. The Pleistocene Ice Age is said to have begun 2.6 million years ago, and we are still in it. This is an interglacial period in the Pleistocene Ice Age. There have been about 40 to 45 advances of glaciers during this period, the last one peaking 20,000 years ago. But there's been interglacial periods, of course, in between each one of these glaciations. That's what we're in today. So in fact, it's colder now than it has been for about 250 million years. It was warmer all the way back to the previous ice age, which was called the Karoo. The Karoo ended 250 million years ago, and it got warmer and stayed warmer until we came into this ice age 2.6 million years ago. Here's the last 5.5 million years. This shows the gradual descent into where they say, okay, this is now the Pleistocene Ice Age. As you can see, it's not a great big drop all at once, so you have to draw the line somewhere, though, when all of a sudden both the North and South Pole are covered in huge sheets of ice. That would indicate an ice age, and when mountains all the way down to Mexico nearly are covered in glaciers, that is an ice age. And this ice age continues. As you can see, the lower temperatures at the bottom there indicate that the ice age is actually still getting colder during the glaciations that occur. We have no idea when this Pleistocene ice age will end. The last one was 100 million years. This one is only 2.6 million. There is no way anybody has a clue as to whether or not, going out of this interglacial period, we will go into the next major glaciation, which would be about 80,000 years from now, the 100,000 year cycle you see there. And then it might just keep repeating itself for who knows how long. Here's getting closer to the future, to the present. These are the last 4 interglacial periods, showing also the last 4 major glaciations, the lower part of the curve. As you can see, the Earth comes out of the major glaciation quickly into the interglacial period and then slowly descends back into the major glaciation. We have a lot of information about what happened during these periods, and as you can see here, through these glacial periods, CO2 and temperature have been in very close sync with each other. So the people who claim that CO2 is controlling temperature say, look, there you have it. CO2 and temperature are in perfect sync, so CO2 must be what controls the temperature. But no, the temperature could be controlling the CO2. Cause and effect works so that there's a cause and then an effect. The effect never comes before the cause, and when you analyze these graphs carefully, you see that it's temperature that changes first, and CO2 follows. That makes sense, because these 100,000 year cycles are based on what is known as the Milankovitch cycles. It's caused by the gravitational force of Jupiter. Unbelievably, but it is. The tides of the Earth also have a factor of Jupiter's gravitational force in them, along with the Moon and Sun, and we know exactly what these forces are. So it makes much more sense to think that the changes to the Earth's orbit and the changes to the Earth's tilt, which are caused by the gravitational effect of Jupiter, are what is causing the CO2 to change. Because when the oceans cool, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and when they warm, they give off carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And this one slide we could talk about for another hour, but got to get moving. Coming very close to the present, this is the longest temperature record by a thermometer. Thermometers weren't invented until around 1650, where this graph starts. And as you can see, the black line is carbon dioxide. The rate at which humans are putting it into the atmosphere. Now, up until around 1950, there was almost no change in the amount of CO2 going up on a fairly steady curve. Then all of a sudden, it shoots up from about 1900, and then after 1950, just becomes almost like exponential upwards. The temperature curve is not responding to this in any significant way. Actually, if you look back at the beginning of the temperature curve, you can see a period that goes from about 1690 to 1730 or 40, where the temperature rises for a longer period and more degrees than it ever does again in this curve. So this is an indication that CO2 and temperature don't have an awful lot to do with each other, that they are not a cause-effect relationship. So after that brief introduction of climate change, carbon dioxide, temperature, and the history of life, let's talk about some of the issues in my new book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. We have to admit that polar bears are not invisible, but they are very remote. Very few people would be able to go to the Arctic and count all the polar bears around the Arctic Circle. That's why it's easy to make up a story that polar bears are going to go extinct because the ice is all going to melt on the Arctic. But we will find out that this is not true. The truth is, if it weren't for climate change, there would be no polar bears. They would never have existed if the North Pole had not frozen over as we plunged into the Pleistocene Ice Age. That is a fact. Where did the polar bear come from then, if it didn't exist before that? Polar bears are a direct descendant of the Eurasian brown bear, which we call grizzly bears in North America, but they came here to the New World long after the polar bear evolved from the brown bears on the other side of the world in Russia and Northern Europe. What happened was, as the world cooled, you saw that 50 million year cooling period, well, fairly recently in terms of that long period, maybe about 2 million years ago, the Arctic was starting to freeze over every winter, right to the shore of Russia and Europe on the north. So the brown bears, some of them went out on the ice because they're seals that are coming up through the ice to breathe and to birth their pups on the ice. So there's a meal. Gradually, it separated into two populations. And gradually, what was a brown bear turned into a polar bear. White fur because they're now in a white environment, and a more carnivorous diet resulted in changes to their digestive system. This is called divergent evolution, and it has happened all through the history of life. When it's called speciation. When species evolve into two like this, it's almost always because they either become geographically isolated, where they are separate breeding populations, or because they are in such different habitats, one on the land and one on the ice, that they develop different characteristics over hundreds of thousands of years. This doesn't happen in a few years. This takes a long time. Evolution has taken a long time, and that there's no difference with polar bears evolving from Eurasian brown bears. But if it wasn't for the onset of a new ice age, the one we're in now, there would never have been any polar bears. Polar bears are much larger than brown bears. They've also evolved to become bigger, possibly because they're dealing with large seals as prey that they have to be able to pull up through a hole in the ice when they catch them with their claws. They're both very fierce animals, and you sure wouldn't want to tangle with one. The polar bear being, as there you say, 1,000 kilos, over 2,000 pounds. Quite an animal. This is one of the worst things National Geographic has ever done. To show a dying, starving polar bear in the summer, when there's no snow on the ground. People don't know that the Arctic doesn't stay icy all year in many parts of it. Says this is what climate change looks like. No, that's what a starving polar bear looks like when it's so old that it's lost most of its teeth and it's just dying of old age. Most people don't know that the main cause of death in polar bears is starvation, because they are top predators. Nothing can attack them. Even when they're near death, they could still take your face off. So it's not really fair to say this is the climate change doing this, because it's been happening for hundreds of thousands of years that polar bears have died in this way. There are no old folks' homes for old polar bears, no nursing homes for these guys. They die in the wild like all wild animals do. Here's the most recent ice cover for the Arctic. In the top left, you see last winter, the most recent one. You can see the entire Arctic Ocean is still covered in ice in the winter. This has been the case all along, as they keep predicting in 10 years there'll be no more ice in the Arctic. The lower right is this year's summer ice, well, last year's summer ice, showing that a huge amount of ice still remains in the summer. But there's open ocean. This is a good thing for polar bears, because the sun in the summer is the only time there is any sun in the Arctic, can shine on the ocean and promote the growth of plankton, which is shown in the lower left, the food chain of the Arctic Ocean, going from plankton to krill, to little fish, to big fish, to seals, and then to polar bears. If there wasn't any open ocean in the Arctic in the summer, there'd be far less food produced for polar bears than there is today. And then there's this great photo of a polar bear and its prey. You can see why they have to be a fairly good size to get something that big when it's got all its blubber and meat on it up through the hole in the ice. One question here that I ask, and nobody knows, even the polar bear experts have not been able to explain to me, why the bear doesn't eat the entrails of the seal. You can see on the right there of the carcass the heart, the liver, and the entrails of the seal. And it doesn't look like the bear's going to eat them if it's taken the last little bits off a rib bone. Very interesting, and I'd like to find that out someday. So, what's happening to the population of polar bears today? Almost no one has heard of the treaty signed by all polar nations in 1973 after being warned by wildlife biologists that too many polar bears were being hunted. Rich people could afford to go up to the Arctic, hire an Inuit guide, and get a bunch of polar bear rugs for their house or their walls or their fireplace. So all the polar nations signed this treaty in 1973, ending the unrestricted hunting of polar bears for good. And since then, nearly 50 years, there's been almost no killing of grizzly bears to speak of. Some Inuit people have a right to take a few bears, but it's like almost none compared to the population. Today, we have absolutely documented fact that the polar bear population is at least 30,000 and possibly as many as 50,000, whereas in 1973 it had been reduced to 6,000 to 8,000 bears. These numbers are official, and yet you still hear people worried about the polar bear going extinct. They don't actually talk about it much in the science and the media anymore because they know these numbers are out and that they are official. And it's people like Susan Crockford in Victoria, BC, who have exposed this lie that the polar bears are going extinct. Now they say they'll go extinct in 2100, 70 years from now. There's no indication whatsoever that polar bears are going to go extinct, and the Arctic is completely covered in ice still every winter, and probably will be for a long, long time to come. Now what's happening in the Arctic? Nunavut is the area of Canada, treeless area of Canada in the far northeast, where the Inuit people live, known before as Eskimos, but now Inuit. They have a government in Iqaluit on Baffin Island. That government has passed legislation called Polar Bear Management Plan for the Nunavut region. The reason they want to manage the polar bears rather than not manage them is because they are ransacking people's homes in their villages and killing some of the villagers. They don't want that to continue, and the reason it's happening, they say, is because there are too many polar bears now. The Inuit people used to control the polar bears. They hunted them for blankets and food. And now they don't hunt them so much, so their population has exploded. And it may be that the reduction in summer ice on the Arctic Ocean has actually contributed to the increase in the population. So hasn't everybody heard about the Inuit Polar Bear Management Plan and how they feel they need to reduce the population somewhat, or at least be able to protect themselves from an animal that you weren't allowed to kill under any circumstances for so many years? Well, no. The only place this news was covered was a very small piece on the CBC in Canada, the radio, and a newspaper in Nunavut, in a town that has 1,200 people. No one else has heard about the Polar Bear Management Plan or the fact that the Inuit people know that the polar bear population has grown exponentially for the last few decades. Oh, the next subject is one of my favorites. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, twice the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This has been reported in the media newspapers, radio, television for years, this Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And if you go on the internet, you can find some images of it. Here's one, for example, actually showing two Great Pacific Garbage Patches. But this is not a photograph. This is an illustration. Somebody's painted this. So it's not really a photograph of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Here's another one. This Great Pacific Garbage Patch appears to be the size of the lower 48 states of the United States, an entire new continent. And here's what CNN said about it. A huge swirling pile of trash in the Pacific Ocean is growing faster than expected and is now 3 times the size of France. According to a 3-year study published in Scientific Reports Friday, the mass known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is about 1.6 million square kilometers in size, up to 16 times bigger than previous estimates. That makes it more than double the size of Texas. Well, it looks like it's even more than double the size of Texas in this one. And here is a new continent. Plastic nation has emerged and threatens to kill the oceans in less than 10 years. This is in the media. What someone has just painted a big brown blob on a photograph of the Earth there. There is no indication of what that really is. Oh, here it is. It says right there, a part of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch underneath this photograph. But look in the background. There's mountains. That's how I twigged to it, and no one else had, apparently. This is from the Japanese tsunami that killed 20,000 people and took whole towns off the land into the sea. It's not fair to use this as the Pacific Garbage Patch, even though it is in the Pacific. It's not the result of people throwing trash away. It's the result of a human disaster that occurred because of the tsunami, which was certainly not caused by people. It was caused by the forces of the earth. Oh, where did this come from? This is a satellite composite photograph from a German satellite in which it does not appear to have any Great Pacific Garbage Patch. You can see the Hawaiian Islands quite clearly in the center there. You can see Fiji, New Zealand, all the Indonesia and everything. It's all very clear. And Hawaii's not twice the size of Texas. So what's going on here? Well, people come up to me after I show this slide, and one person said, it's only the clear plastic, so that's why you can't see it. Well, in fact, clear plastic is 1.2 density and would sink. So they didn't know much about plastic to say that. Then I was told it's just beneath the surface, like as if every piece of plastic has a buoyancy compensation device on it. No, I don't think so. Oh, then you come to the real truth. It's microplastic, they say, in the water column. Oh, you mean it's invisible? That's why we can't see it. Actually, I know a very top fisheries scientist from Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada who goes to sea every year in the North Pacific to monitor things that have to do with salmon and other marine species. And this time, he took a filter to filter out the microplastic in the water column of the sea. He came back thinking he must have made a mistake because there was no microplastic in his filter. In other words, that whole thing is probably a total fabrication too, but because they say it's invisible, you can't prove it's not there until you do take a filter out there and try to find some. Here's after 48 days of searching for plastic all the way between Hawaii and California. This is what they found. It's almost all discarded fishing gear. And it's not in a giant garbage patch. It's scattered all over the place. Now this is something that should be addressed because especially fish nets that are thrown away that are damaged can catch fish. And they can't get out because they're meant to catch them. So it would be good if the plastics people got together with the fisheries people and figured out how to convince the fishermen to bring their damaged plastic goods on shore when they come back with their fish catch. The real problem is boats have a limited amount of space and they want to reserve them for all the fish they catch while they're out there. But I'm sure something could be figured out. It's not as if this is going to kill the Pacific Ocean, though. Greenpeace claims this crab is trapped in the cup. No, it's using it as shelter, a habitat, a home, to escape from predators. The neat thing about plastic in the sea is it has shapes that wood doesn't. I mean, the sea is full of driftwood, always has been since forests were washed down rivers into the ocean. But plastic is in the form of cups and bottles and other shapes that can provide a habitat for a crab and any other number of species. So in that sense, I mean, it is non-toxic. The idea that plastic becomes toxic when it ends up in the ocean, when after we've wrapped all our food in it and drunk all our drinks out of it and put it over all our meat, because it's non-toxic and prevents our food from becoming contaminated, is one of the main uses of plastic. They call it the poison plastic in Greenpeace these days, and that is a lie, because there is nothing toxic about plastic. Here's another example of marine life benefiting from plastic in the ocean. These pelagic barnacles have chosen a small float and have come ashore after living in the sea and procreating out there for maybe a few years. There's nothing wrong with this, just like driftwood. As a matter of fact, plastic is inert, whereas many species of trees have toxins in them, like cedar, for example. That's why it lasts so long on your deck. And redwood, they have toxins in them, and they go in the sea and float around, and things live on them there too. Sir David Attenborough seems like such a fine fellow, but he has told too many lies in his documentaries about wildlife, especially in the sea, where nobody can see what's going on. Here he says, seeing albatross feed chick plastic was heartbreaking, says David Attenborough. David Attenborough says that adult albatross are picking up plastic bags in the ocean and feeding them to their chicks. This is a lie. There is no documented photograph of an albatross feeding a plastic bag to its chick, or any of the other items that are shown in this photograph claiming that they were regurgitated from an albatross chick. Not true. Here is the only photograph I could find of an albatross giving, not feeding, perfectly right-sized bits of plastic to its chick. Now, let's talk about birds feeding hard objects to their chicks. All birds do this. Every bird in the world has a gizzard, which is a second stomach, where they digest food that is difficult to digest, that is tough or hard or skin and stuff like that. Birds don't have teeth. Therefore, unlike mammals, they cannot swallow their food, chew their food before they swallow it. The gizzard is a place where they grind their food using hard objects as grinders in a muscular stomach. Seabirds cannot find pebbles, whereas land birds invariably do use pebbles to provide a digestive aid in their gizzard. Seabirds have to use things that are floating on the ocean by and large, and that includes hard bits of wood. It includes pumice, which is lava that has come up from undersea volcanoes, and because it's porous, it floats. They like that really a lot, but it isn't always available. They'll use nuts. They will feed their chicks squids, which have beaks in them. Those beaks are retained in the gizzard to grind the food. And for the last 50 years, they have been using hard bits of certain shaped, like nice shaped, you can see there's no plastic bags going into that chick. That's what they put in the chick's gizzard to help digest their food. David Attenborough says they're feeding plastic bags, mistaking it for food. That is a lie. and he knows it. Here is a stage image of a dead albatross chick filled with plastic objects. There is never anything like this in a dead chick. This is staged. It's an absolute fact. People have been studying plastic in the gizzards of birds for 50 years, ever since plastic first went into the ocean. At first they were alarmed by it, but there are many scientific reports that have been written on this, making it clear that they did not see any harm coming from the albatross using plastic as a substitute for the many other things they've been using for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions. There's no albatross chick that could have that much plastic in it in the first place. What should we do with the combustible materials such as plastic, wood, and paper, all of life origin, by the way? What should we do with these materials that are not suitable for recycling? Thin plastic film, for example, in plastic, pizza boxes with paper and other soiled paper, and bits of wood from construction demolition that are full of nails and are too short to use for anything else. What you do is you put them into a state-of-the-art waste-to-energy plant. Europe gets 4% of its electricity from waste-to-energy plants by burning and making heat and electricity from waste that is not suitable for recycling. Here's the graph from Europe. It's really interesting. On the left you will see the countries mostly of Western Europe. The orange is waste to energy. They are putting a large percentage, close to 50% in some cases, into waste to energy plants and using it to make electricity and heat. Then the green is recycling. As you can see, the first 6 or 7 countries there are recycling or waste to energy for all their solid waste that is combustible. Whereas as you go into Eastern Germany and some of the other countries, the red is landfill. The anti-waste to energy people, who are the same as the climate change is an emergency people, say that we should not have waste to energy plants because then nobody will recycle anything. It's very easy to see there that the countries that do the most waste to energy also do the most recycling. Very clear. They have a very purpose plan policy that you either recycle or you go to waste to energy. And it's only the red ones that have not got that perfect yet, but all of them actually could. If one country can do it, so can all the others. In North America, however, more than 50% of all our waste goes to landfill, largely because of opposition from the so-called Greens to using the waste for energy, and thus reducing the amount of fossil fuels, hydro, nuclear, wind, solar, or whatever that we have to create, because it's being used for something useful. Here's the Chinese latest waste-to-energy plant, covered in solar panels on the roof and producing 168 megawatts of electricity. That is a large amount of electricity, and it can be done all over the world using the materials that are now going into basically dumps. They like to call them landfills, but they're basically dumps because there's no intention to do anything good with that material ever. Now we come to, I guess, one of my very favorite subjects, because I've been an avid snorkeler and scuba diver for decades, and it just pains me so that people are being told that the coral reefs are dying all around the world, especially the Great Barrier Reef. It's a lie. It's because you can't see them and because they make up stories about them that you think that they are endangered, when in fact coral reefs are largely healthy all around the world. There's a few examples of coral reefs that are close to big cities that have been damaged by fishing and too much diving, but by and large the big reefs in this world are in beautiful condition, and I've seen them with my own eyes. But let's start with this. In 2016, early in the year, scientists said 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is now bleached, or 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is practically dead, or over 90% of the Great Barrier Reef suffering from coral bleaching. Take note of the fact that none of these say dead. One says now bleached, one says practically dead. Practically dead is not dead. It's somewhere before death. You don't even know when something is practically dead, whether it actually will be dead soon. And suffering from coral bleaching. Reefs don't suffer. That's not the right word to be using, but that's what they used. So here, this is why people think that over 90% of the coral reef is dead, but they're using tricky wording in order to imply that it is, or that it's going to be soon, or whatever. The next year, now the Great Barrier Reef is terminal. Great Barrier Reef at terminal stage. Great Barrier Reef in its final terminal stage, as if there's other terminal stages before the final one. How many terminal stages are there? Well, I thought there was only one, the terminal stage, the stage just before you die. But it still doesn't say dead. It says terminal. About a year and a half later, very few media covered this, but Newsweek did. Great Barrier Reef, definitely not dead. Significant signs of recovery. Bloomberg, Great Barrier Reef showing signs of recovery. Scientific American, coral reefs show remarkable ability to recover from near death. Well, I don't know what to think about that. I mean, don't we all have a remarkable ability to recover from near death? Because it happens all the time. Sometimes you think a person's going to die and then they don't. So this was all fake news, 100% fake news. And the reason it was fake news is because bleaching is not dying. Bleaching is simply ejecting the phytoplankton that the zooplankton, which is the coral animal related to a jellyfish, therefore clear. It hasn't got any color. And limestone is white. Calcium carbonate, that's what the shell of the coral is made from. So when coral bleaches, like the word bleach is the problem here. Because bleach is something that you think of as being a very strong poisonous substance, like bleaching clothes to make them white. It's not the same. Bleaching of the coral reef has nothing to do with bleach. It has to do with ejecting the colorful plankton and then taking up new ones later. Coral reefs almost recover. It's not as if they're nearly dead. The animal, which is the actual animal of the coral reef, is still in there alive, quite happily alive in there, and is bound to recover most of the time. So the problem with this reporting of the death of the Great Barrier Reef is that one would expect scientists, reef scientists, and reporters who study environmental issues would know that bleaching is not the same as death. As a matter of fact, it's part of the life cycle of coral reefs. They all do this, and usually they survive. It's not as if reefs aren't damaged, though. The main problem is hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons, as they're called, the same thing, but three different names for massive ocean storms, which can damage coral reefs. But coral reefs grow back just like forests do. And so people are really being misled on this subject. The idea that coral reefs are being destroyed by global warming and whatever else is causing the bleaching. Bleaching is a perfectly natural phenomenon. Here's an illustration that shows the temperature of the oceans on the other side of the Earth from us, but it shows there that the Coral Triangle, which is the name given to the area north of Australia, where the oceans are warmer than they are at the Great Barrier Reef. shows that they are the richest marine life in the world. That's what they are. That's the warmest ocean in the world. It's protected from the cold southern waters by Australia and from the northern cold waters by Asia. And it's also a shallow sea in the Indonesian archipelago, so it's the warmest ocean in the world, and that's all there is to it. This area has the highest biodiversity of corals and reef fishes and many other marine species of anywhere else in the world. The Caribbean, which is the second warmest ocean in the world, has the second highest biodiversity of corals and reef fish, but they have lost 50% of their corals since the 50 million year descent into a colder world occurred. It's cold that is the enemy of coral, not heat. Corals like warm water, and they have lived in warm water all through the hot periods of the Earth for 200 million years. They were much more extensively spread out than they are today. Corals have retreated into the warmest oceans in the world in a colder world than has been for a long, long time. Here's a study, published, peer-reviewed study. On the top chart, you see all marine taxa, 13 different categories of species, everything from jellyfish up to coral reefs, etc., all the fish and everything. See that the most biodiverse area of the sea is in the Indonesian area. Next is coastal fishes, showing even more concentration of coastal fishes, in other words, fishes that would be around coral reefs if there were any, are there. And then the bottom one, corals. The Indonesian area, the Coral Triangle, is basically the only place left in the world that has a high variety of corals and reef fish. 600 species of corals, 2,000 species of reef fish. If this isn't proof that corals prefer warm water over cooler water, I don't know what is. There isn't any argument with this, and yet they portray it as if warmer water is the enemy of coral, when in fact it is colder water. There are no coral reefs in England or in Japan or off the west coast of Canada. The coral reefs are confined to the warm tropics. Here's an example of the Coral Triangle biodiversity. It's so beautiful. I've been there on 2 big expeditions, 14 days each, in different parts of Indonesia. And you just see so much color and so much variety. It's something everyone should do, but not everybody gets the chance to, only a few people. But if you were an avid snorkeler and you traveled around the world to all the dive sites, you would see how healthy most of the coral reefs in the world are today. Okay, now we come to a subject that drives me a bit crazy. This is the one where, again, Sir David Attenborough is the culprit. He says hundreds of walruses committed suicide by leaping to their death due to lack of ice on the sea, when in fact a pack of polar bears were approaching the walruses with the intent to kill and eat them. Here are part of that pack of polar bears. The people who live in the town nearby where this happened, on northern Russia's coast, very remote location, saw this happening. It wasn't filmed, unfortunately. David Attenborough filmed the walruses falling down the cliff. But I think walruses would rather take a chance of living by falling down a cliff than they would like to be eaten alive by a polar bear. Here's the walrus colony, and you can see the cliff where the walruses have somehow managed to wobble up to the top there, because there's so many of them trying to get out of the sea into this haul-out area. We don't really understand why walruses haul out. To give birth is one reason, and to suckle their young, but they do. Now, Attenborough says that the walruses are coming ashore out of desperation because there's not enough ice for them here. This is the summer in northern Russia. when there isn't usually any ice there anyway. Why is this then designated an official walrus sanctuary, this particular spot? It's because they come out here very often and go ashore. It's not out of desperation. It's out of wanting to be out of the ocean for one reason or another. Here is what would have happened to those walruses if they hadn't jumped off the cliff, or walruses can't actually jump. They rolled off the cliff because they didn't want to be eaten by polar bears. And here is a scene offshore. This is David Attenborough's film crew here in the scene where they filmed the walruses falling off the cliff. You can see all those walruses out there in a line. Why are they out there? They're out there to feed. Attenborough says the walrus's home is on the ice. No, it is not. There's nothing on the ice for the walruses. The walrus's home is along the shoreline in the ocean. They dive up to 300 feet, that's the maximum. So they cannot fish in more than 300 feet of water. And what are they fishing for? Clams and other species in the mud below. That's what their tusks are for, to dig out the species that live on the bottom of the sea up to 300 feet deep, which isn't very deep. They are a coastal animal. Their home is in the ocean, like with seals and sea lions and other pinnipeds, the seal family. David Attenborough, when asked about this by people who know that he was telling a lie, he said, "I just say what they write for me." That is not becoming of a man who is an expert in wildlife and birds. As with the albatross, he is not telling the truth. He is telling us a lie which we cannot observe or verify for ourselves to find the truth. This is a perfect example of the universal theory of scare stories, things that are either invisible, remote, or both. This is the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion. It's the only nuclear accident in the history of nuclear energy that has killed people. 56 people died as a result of the Chernobyl accident, according to the World Health Organization. Other people say it's 300,000, like Greenpeace said it was 300,000, but these are people with no names or gravestones or any actual identity, so it's a made-up figure. 56 people are known to have died. Most of them were firefighters trying to put out the fire that blazed for 10 days in a huge piece of carbon that was the moderator of the reactor. Graphite, which is pure carbon, was burning there, continuing to send radioactive elements from the reactor core into the atmosphere. Chernobyl was a stupid designed reactor. I can only say it like that. It was a reactor design that had the potential to be a nuclear bomb under certain circumstances. This didn't happen during normal operating procedures. It happened when a group of engineers from Nuclear Central in Moscow came down and told the operators what to do. One of the things they told them to do was to shut off the safety systems. That's what went wrong. They put the reactor in a condition that resulted in basically a nuclear bomb, slowly exploding, but causing a huge amount of damage, as you can see. Both 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, which were meltdown accidents, are completely different than this accident. In those cases, there was no massive explosion of the nuclear core. In Fukushima, the hydrogen that was coming out of the core was allowed to build up and explode in the containment structures, which was one of the dumbest things I've ever seen done in my life. But that's what they let happen. They didn't have to. They could have easily let the gases out so the hydrogen didn't accumulate. But the fact of the matter is, all the Chernobyl reactors outside Russia have been shut down, and all the ones inside Russia, I believe there are still 10 operating, have been completely modified so that this can never happen again. And this can never happen in any of the other reactors in the United States, Canada, Japan, etc., China, India, because they have not been built in a way that could have this accident happen. Here's 2 of 4 modern nuclear reactors in Korea. It's neat, the Koreans actually try to make their nuclear reactors look kind of nice. They put marble on the walls inside, whereas in most countries they just leave bare concrete. I think it would make a lot of sense to follow the Korean example and make the nuclear reactors look just a little bit pretty, because they are producing a huge amount of electricity. These 2 reactors are capable of supplying electricity to 2 million homes. Just those what are not that large a structure. There are 11 countries in the world that produce over 1/3 of their electricity from nuclear energy. Most of them are actually in Europe, but the United States is not in that category because it uses so much electricity that it only amounts to about 15%. But the US has way more reactors than everyone else, over 90 of them operating continuously among the 440 or so in the world. And my point here about nuclear is that if we really do wish to replace fossil fuels with a different technology, nuclear is the only one that can really do the job properly. It runs continuously, it produces huge amount of power at a reasonable price, and that's why China, India, and Russia are all moving full speed ahead on nuclear energy for the future. Here's the global energy consumption by fuel type. You can see liquids, meaning fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal, account for over 80% of all the world energy used in the world. And if you look at what it's being used for, much of it is industrial use, which includes buildings, large buildings, transportation, residential, and commercial. About 40% of all energy used in the world, of all energy consumption, not just electricity, is for buildings. Heating, cooling, hot water, and appliances in buildings. Virtually 100% of that can be supplied by nuclear energy. In fact, anything that is stationary, that doesn't have to travel like a plane or a boat or a truck, it's difficult to tether them to an electric wire, but anything you can put an electric wire to that is stationary, huge steel mills, huge electric motors, and even excavators in big mines that don't move very far in a day can be tethered with electric cables, and thus more than 50% of the electricity in the world could be provided just with stationary things. Now, what about moving things? Russia has 5 nuclear icebreakers in the Arctic. If you can run a nuclear icebreaker in the Arctic, you can probably put nuclear in oil tankers and cargo ships. Same for submarines, even more so. There are lots of submarines that carry 100 nuclear missiles underwater for 3 months, propelled by nuclear power. So all shipping, all deep sea shipping, could easily be nuclear. The same is true of all trains. All trains could be electrified and run on nuclear energy. Let's turn now to the subject of fossil fuels. Here is a graph from when they first began measuring CO2 concentration in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. As you can see, there has been a steady and ever slightly increasing level of CO2 in the atmosphere since 1960, and this actually goes back to about 1900, where you can actually start to see a significant increase in CO2 from human CO2 emissions. This is almost all from fossil fuels, 95%, and cement production, turning the limestone that marine calcifying creatures cause to become sediment on the bottom of the sea into cement causes the release of the carbon dioxide that the marine creatures took out of the sea in the first place. The main effect of this carbon dioxide increase has been a greening of the earth. CO2 is the main fertilizer for all plant life, and plant life is the main feedstock for all life. In other words, all the insects and animals and fungus and other things that do not photosynthesize. So CO2 has increased the rate of photosynthesis greatly because it was at such a low level when we came along and started adding some back into the atmosphere where it had first came from. It's really important to remember, we're not adding CO2 to the atmosphere that was never there in the first place. We're just putting it back. In other words, rebalancing the global carbon cycle of life. Here's another chart. That one was from NASA, the previous one. This one is from the Australian top science body, the Commonwealth Science and Industry Research Organization. They were the ones who broke this story, in fact, showing how much additional greening of the earth there has been just since 1982 to 2013. Here is the map of India and China. Opposite what they're saying, that India and China are the biggest polluters, referring to carbon dioxide, they are actually contributing the most to the fertilization of the earth, increased crop production, increased forest growth, and increased growth of wild plants in virtually all environments. That's because they're putting more CO2 fertilization into the atmosphere than any other countries, and because they're growing more crops than any other countries because they have more people than any other countries to eat that food. So they are the biggest part of the global cycle of carbon dioxide and life, making food for the human population and for many other species. Insects get a lot of the life as their food, and so do all the other grazing animals. So to conclude, fossil fuels are 100% organic, as in the scientific meaning of the word organic. Organic chemistry is the chemistry of carbon, the chemistry of life. Carbon is the element which has more possible combinations of combining with other elements than any other element. That's why it's so suitable for something so complex as life, living beings. All of the fossil fuels were produced with solar energy. There's no exception to this. They were produced by trees on the land, which produced the coal. They were produced by species in the ocean, which fell dead to the bottom and produced the oil and gas. Where oil and gas is now being drilled in Texas all the way north to Alberta, that was once a sea bottom. Where the coal is, was once a huge forest, produced with solar energy. The solar energy was used to combine water and carbon dioxide to make sugar, glucose, the energy for all life, made by photosynthesis, feeding its way up the food chain from plankton and food for us into all the animals and insects that are not able to photosynthesize. That's how they get their energy to live. When we burn fossil fuels, we are converting them back to water and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide that we are producing when we burn fossil fuels was taken from the atmosphere and lost to the cycle of life over the hundreds of millions of years that sediments have built up of fossil fuels, and primarily of carbonaceous rocks, the limestone, chalk, and marble from the shells of marine calcifying species. By putting this CO2 back into the air, where it will go into the oceans, we are restoring a balance to the global carbon cycle, not poisoning the earth, not causing the earth to get so hot that it will be unsuitable for life. That is not what is happening. What is happening is we are putting the CO2 back into the environment, into the cycle of life between the atmosphere, the oceans, and all of living creation that was so much richer before it was lost to the sediments, and now we're putting it back. Can you believe that? No other species could have done what we are doing. CO2 was heading for a very, very low period. So I think the most important lesson from this presentation for me is that carbon dioxide is being maligned in such a way. It's not like a poison like people are trying to tell you. It is the basis of all life on Earth. And people have to understand that there was once far more of it, long before we were all born, but during the process of the evolution of life. It's, people say, well, yeah, but we weren't around when it was higher like that. That is not the point. Our ancestors were around then. People sometimes don't stop to think that they represent a continuous, successful reproduction since the beginning of life. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here now. In a certain sense, our generation of life has gone through more changes in climate and in all kinds of matters on this earth than the ones before us did, because we've been here longer in that sense. We descended from other species, which descended from other species, which descended from other species, and they all lived through all the stages of the Earth's climate, most of which was much warmer than it is now. So first, the idea that CO2 controls the world's temperatures has no basis in fact, historically. Second, the idea that CO2 is somehow a problem for human health or for the health of life is also not true. The CO2 we're putting back into the atmosphere is the same CO2 that was there in the first place, that was taken out, causing the gradual decline in CO2 over the many millennia. And fossil fuels are basically the essence of that CO2 that was trapped in sediments, in fossil fuels and rocks, and is now being put back through our actions, which is supporting our civilization. The human population has grown from 1 billion to 8 billion in 200 years. It's largely due to the use of fossil fuels and concrete and technology and medicine and all the other things that make up modern life. And if we think we can give up fossil fuels without creating a disaster far worse than anything imaginable, well, nothing imaginable can happen bad from CO2. That's the point. It's a myth, and it's all based on things that are invisible and remote, and CO2 is the central one of those invisible things. Now, in the time I've had with you, I can't give you more than 5% of what's actually in my book, which goes into much more detail in easy language. There's no big words in the book, and any big word that there is explained very carefully, but there's very few of them. But all these topics are covered and more. The chapter called Climate of Fear and Guilt is the longest one, and it's the most technical one, of course, because it has to do with the whole issue of global warming and carbon dioxide and Earth's temperature history and all of that and more. But it's worth reading. Africa's oldest trees are dying is another chapter in which we see the falsehood of these kinds of headlines. And I mean, Africa's oldest trees are in Africa, in the middle of Africa somewhere where hardly anybody's going to see them. Coral reefs, species extinction is something I haven't covered here, but there's an excellent exposition of that subject as well in the book. Genetically modified foods, I mentioned them, but there's lots more to learn. Radiation from nuclear energy, the whole issue of health effects of radiation is covered in the book. Forest fires. Now they're telling us that forest fires are caused by climate change. I thought they were caused by trees struck by lightning, or people carelessly throwing cigarette butts and leaving campfires going, and mismanagement of the forest. That's what forests are caused by, not by climate change. Ocean acidification. Now there's a fake deal. When the temperature stopped rising for about 20 years, around the year 2000, I guess they had to make up another scare story, and they chose ocean acidification, saying that the increase in CO2 would cause the oceans to become acidic and kill everything, at least especially the shelled creatures. It's a total lie. The oceans could never become acidic. CO2 has been way higher in the past, and the oceans didn't become acidic. So this is a total falsehood. At least with carbon dioxide, it is a greenhouse gas, a very minor one, and doesn't play a very large role in the cycles of global temperature. But it is there and does have some effect on the Earth's temperature. And finally, mass walrus death from CO2, lack of ice, as I've explained to you. None of these stories are true about the effects of climate change and invisible things like radiation. None of them are true. But they're giving people a lot of fear. And that's how they're controlling us, through fear and guilt. You're driving down the freeway in your SUV, you're afraid you're killing your grandchildren. That makes you guilty, feeling guilty. That makes you open your wallet and send a big check to some organization that says it's going to save you from this somehow. How are they going to save you from the fact that we need energy every day? It has to be reliable, it has to be cost effective. The main reason I'm in favor of nuclear energy is not because it gets rid of fossil fuels, because it conserves them for the future, to use for things that can't be done easily with any other substance or technology. Aircraft, for example, large trucks and tractors and combines in agriculture, huge machines in mines, in some cases, need to be run on fossil fuels, but in many cases can be switched to nuclear. Whereas wind and solar are unreliable, really expensive. The only reason they exist is the subsidies, mandates, and tax breaks that they're getting from all of us. It's costing a lot more than the bill you get for your electricity. And in fact, wind and solar energy are basically parasites on the larger economy. I have said for a long time that they should prove that wind and solar farms can be built with wind and solar energy alone. Do they really think that they can build solar farms and wind farms without fossil fuels for the mining and the trucking and the industry, the manufacturing, the construction, and all that is required to put these huge things that take up massive areas for a small amount of electricity they put out? Whereas fossil fuel generators and nuclear energies and hydroelectric plants do it on a small footprint, are reliable 24/7, and reasonably cost effective, unlike wind and solar energy. Wind energy actually kills millions of birds every year around the world, and in the United States, for some reason, only wind farms are exempted from killing large predatory birds like eagles, hawks, owls, etc. So with that, I'll leave you to hopefully order my book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, from Amazon anywhere in the world you live. If there's an Amazon in your country, you can get it there. If you can't get it there, you can get it from one close by. It is a groundbreaking book. It postulates a whole new thesis about why there are so many scare stories, that people can't verify the truth for themselves. And it's had hugely good reviews. Over 1,200 reviews on Amazon.com, with 95% of them 4- and 5-star reviews. And most of the 1- and 2-star reviews are cranks anyways that don't think my ideas are correct. But believe me, they are. If you can disprove anything I have said here, I hope you will let me know. My email is in the front of the book if you want to get a message to me. But I only talk about things that I know are true. And if somebody can convince me that anything I say is not true, I will change my mind. And no one will hear me saying something that is wrong again. But I check my stuff before I go forward with a video presentation like this. And I look forward to people's comments, criticisms, if you have them, and I hope you enjoy the book. Thank you very much.